Testing. Testing. What didn't do it?
Yeah, she was supposed to last week.
What you found about
Testing. Testing. Testing.
No, it's
All right, we're gonna get started. Can anyone give us a thumbs up if you can hear us online? We got some thumbs up. All right. Well, thanks for joining. So we got our March forum with the WPA. Just to kick things off, before we introduce the speakers. Yeah, looking ahead for the WPA, we've got an April forum back here in person with Bowser and the MPCA for an FQA and HGM training. And then further into April, we have the Marcel Spruce trip in northern Minnesota on April 24th, and there's a couple spots left. So if you're interested in joining, I think we have 5 spots left. So make sure to sign up with the link we sent out. But I think that's all for today.
Heather, would you poll the audience who we have today, whether they would like for us to have a special wetlands session at the Water Resources Conference again, and they can just type it in the chat, and how many here would like for the WPA to try to get a wetlands session at the Water Resources Conference at the U of M? Or are those things already being handled in other forums like Wisconsin Wetlands, or? Nobody wants it?
I think it'd be good. That was for us.
Yeah.
That embedded with that conference because it's pretty expensive.
It is, yeah.
Yeah,
Water resources.
yeah.
I don't think we wanna, cause even presenters have to pay to attend. So I don't think that we wanna sponsor a special session. It's already time to solicit abstracts. If there's not a lot of people who would wanna actually attend that session. So if folks would just type in the chat, that'd be great. And then I think we could get started.
Yeah, and we can send out a poll or something online too.
All right.
But yeah,
So the folks online can still hear okay if we're this far from the owl? Yeah.
can people still hear Jenny?
Is this your first time using the owl?
We did use it last.
Alyssa gave us a thumbs up.
Complaints.
You're good.
Oh,
So,
they're good.
well, thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Jenny Skanke, Wetlands Program Consultant at the DNR and also a member of the WPA board. So today we are gonna talk in depth about calcareous fens in Minnesota. We're gonna do a little bit of a tag team here. I've got Megan Benage and Ann Hall, also from the DNR, but in the just with us. She's coming up on 11 years with the DNR, but 20 years as an ecologist. I frequently reviews because Megan has really an infectious love of the prairie and natural resources and calcareous fens. And it is a delight, and one of our best people, I think, at the Minnesota DNR for working collaboratively outside of the DNR with other organizations to advocate for protection and restoration of our resources. So thank you very much, Megan and Ann, for being here. I'm gonna pipe in a little bit with the regulatory components since calcareous fens fall under some of my responsibilities, but Megan's gonna kick things off.
Okay, we're up, it's happening. You're supposed to undersell, not oversell. So that way you're pleasantly surprised, you know, so you're not like, oh, they said she's gonna be great, and I just thought it was okay.
Where's the
You know?
percentage?
So, that was a very, very kind introduction, but I also am gonna say, because we do everything in partnership, our calcareous fen work would be nothing without Ann. Ann is the person who carries all the equipment. And she's the person who knows all about soils and hydrology and chemistry. And I mostly just know about the ecosystem as a whole and then plants. So that's the lens I'm gonna focus on, and then Ann will fill in the pieces, and like Jenny said, she'll fill in all the legal stuff.
Is it working? We had it working.
We did have it working, and now it's like, shoot, now you're trying to present, I'm not gonna do it. Here, let me see here. It wouldn't be a meeting without a technological snafu.
Didn't work.
There you go. The rest just needs to wake up. So, a little bit of overview. This is, of course, what kind of a wetland? It's a calcareous fen. It's a whole thing today. It's called calcareous fens. This was the gimme question. You all failed. All right, so we're gonna talk a little bit about what are they, where are they, how do they function, why are they important, how are they protected a little bit today. And I wandered, so it's good when I give presentations at home because I have to be at my computer looking at my notes. When I give presentations to people, I just wander around, and of course, there's like one person in the front row, just like church. So we're gonna just pretend like everybody online is the front row. So first and foremost, what is a calcareous fen? For one thing, we gave it the worst name possible because anytime I meet with landowners, they're like, they don't feel comfortable saying the word calcareous. And so they're usually like, what's that wet thing you got out there? That fen thing. And I'm like, yes, it's a calcareous fen. So you probably already know it's called calcareous because it's calcium rich. So fens are rare peat accumulating wetlands, and they depend on a constant supply of groundwater. What we mean by peat accumulating is just that. So every year, that fen, if it's healthy, should be gaining peat. Not gaining in the sense that you go out there and you're like, wow, this thing is way taller than it was last year. We're talking like centimeters at most. But it should be gaining, and that's something that we use and we'll talk about later on. When a fen is declining, we start to see that peat subside, and that's a way that you can kind of tell how it's doing. Of course, a lot of times, when you can see that subsidence, you already have a bigger problem on your hands. Because they're super duper rare in the state of Minnesota, they're protected. I don't know, are they protected in Wisconsin or elsewhere?
Not really.
Firm no from Scott, I'll take it. So they are protected here. And basically, it's probably the strongest legislation we have for any natural community. So it basically says you cannot harm them unless the commissioner, and in this case, the commissioner is the Department of Natural Resources Commissioner, decides that an alteration to that community is necessary. And I would say we don't have very many instances where the commissioner agrees that that is necessary. I'm not going to speak for them because I'm not them, but in the history of DNR, it's pretty rare that if you have a fen that they're going to say, yep, we're going to allow an alteration. So they are super sensitive. Some people call them the Goldilocks habitat. They're sensitive to both water quality and quantity, and it goes both directions. So they don't like too much water and they don't like too little water. So they have to be in this just right conditions. And that's why people call them a Goldilocks habitat, because they need it to be just right in order to persist and exist. They're also, and this is probably the only place you'll hear this, they're pretty adorable. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but they're pretty cute. Scott would agree with me. They're adorable. Like, I'm just calling his name out because I know his name. So he's gonna get called out last day. But they are. They're super duper cute. They're adorable. They're rare, and there's something really special about a calcareous fen. You walk in them, and there's nothing else like them. I always think of them like Minnesota's miniature Everglades, because that's kind of what the pattern peatland in them looks like. Of course, we don't have alligators, we have fen snails and other things, so, pick your poison. I think it's a good thing we don't have alligators, because the worst thing that's ever happened to me in a fen is a snake falling on me, which that in of itself is not pleasant.
Does this work?
It does work now. Well, I fixed it.
Okay.
I did.
So where are they found? And actually, this slide should be more like, what forms do they take? And in Minnesota, they take basically 3 different forms. The windows and the side slope seeps, which I'm going to call apron type fence, because side slope seeps is really difficult to say, even one time fast. So, and then the third type are beach ridges, which are up north in DNR's Region 1. And so I've never actually seen one of those. So I'm going to talk basically about the first 2. And so with dome type fens or windows extending from confined aquifers. So beneath that dome, what you're going to find is underneath the ground, you're going to find basically a layer cake of confining layers that are clay-rich layers with lots and lots of sediment, and then sand and gravel aquifers. that would provide the water. And in that confining layer that has all that clay in it, it's creating some pressure on top of that aquifer. So the water that's within the aquifer is pressurized. And somewhere there, wherever that dome is, there's going to be some sort of fracture or fractures or a fissure or something that allows for that pressurized water. It's a conduit basically for that pressurized water to go up through that confining layer and reach the surface and discharge out on the surface. And apron type fens, or the side slope, I'm going to say that, that's an example of groundwater discharge that's really pretty diffuse along a hillside. And apron implies exactly what it does. So we have this nice mineral layer that's overlaid by just a nice layer of peat, and it kind of flows down. And the beach ridges, I would imagine they are somewhat like the
beach ridges are surprisingly small, so you might think of it as a hillside, but it's actually like barely visible sometimes. So they're kind of more like the window.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I didn't know it. Your standards. I did. There we go. So the down button.
The down button.
Okay. So this is a map of where we have all of our listed fens. The dome and the apron type fens are what we have down in region 4, which is basically this area down here. Beach ridges are going to be found up in this area. And then there are a lot more apron type fens down here, kind of associated with rivers that are in the Minnesota River Valley and trout streams and things like that. We have several dome fens that are here and several more that are down here. Should I do the right one?
I'm gonna go back just for a second because I want to point something out. So we have roughly 320 fens statewide, and the reason why I say roughly, if you're like, DNR, don't you know? One, we're still finding them, so Minnesota hasn't been completely mapped, and so it is possible to find a fen. I don't like to say we found a new fen, because it's weird to call something that's been on the landscape for 4,000 to 10,000 years new. It's not new, it's just maybe new to the DNR's mapping, because it's also not new if you think about it in an indigenous context. So another thing I want to point out, tornado. Let's you see that the whole room shook. Okay, so the other thing I want to point out is mapping can be sometimes complex, and we now have standardized mapping. In the past, and we have some other slides that'll show this a little bit better, but if a fen crosses a road, but the hydrology is connected, do you map it as one fen or do you map it as two fens? These are the questions that we struggle with on a daily basis. We made a decision as a DNR that we map that as two fens because there's a physical barrier in between them, even though ecologically it's one fen. Right? We have the same thing happen when fens cross counties. It's confusing, but so you end up with like an Altona South and an Altona North, wherever that county line is. Even though for ecological purposes, again, those fens are hydrologically connected. So that can get pretty complicated. Another thing is that fens sometimes have pockets, and as you walk through a wetland, it's sometimes unclear where that fen ends hydrologically when you're doing that site visit and when you're suddenly in a new hydrologic system, because you're still walking through the same wetland complex. So mapping can get a little bit tricky. The other thing that's super cool, and you can't see it on this slide, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, is a lot of times in the river valley, these fens, particularly these ones, they'll repeat at the exact same elevation, but maybe 50 miles away. So we have two fens right here where they're in the exact same slope position, the exact same spacing above the river at the exact same elevation, but I think 56 miles apart from each other. Nature's all connected. It's pretty neat. Like, it's weird little nerdy things like this that get us excited. Now you know more about us than you ever wanted to know. It's just exciting. It's exciting when you start to see patterns in nature and you start to figure out how things are connected and what that might mean for how we can protect these forever, basically. So I probably, for this group, you don't need convincing, right? Like, why are calcareous fens important? Why would we study them? Why do we care so much about these communities? But I'm gonna tell you anyway. So it's used to say the rarest community in the United States. I had to fact check myself, it's not true. They're the rarest wetland community for sure in the United States, but there are other, we could argue that prairie, for example, is more rare or at the same level of rarity. But again, it doesn't really matter how rare you are. The very fact that you're rare means that you're worth protecting. You're a valuable part of the ecosystem. One of our Calcareous Fens folks doesn't like when I say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. So I know he's not here. So fens did form after glaciers receded. The part that he doesn't want people to get confused about is that somehow the action of the glacier receding formed the fen, because it's everything that happened after that moment. Right, so the glaciers receded, they shaped the landscape, and then certain things happened on the landscape in terms of hydrology and soil formation, and those things that eventually led to Calcareous fens being formed. So a lot of times when I'm feeling sassy and talking to a landowner and they say things like, well, that sounds great. This fence seems nice, but I don't want it there because I want to do this thing that I want to do. So how about you go build it elsewhere? And then usually if I'm feeling sassy, my response is, do you have a glacier in your back pocket? No? Well, looks like it's got to stay where it is. I work for the government, I'm here to help. So anyway, person in the back got it. So they are where they are, right? Like they are where they are. We can't move them. Nature's shaped in a very precise and specific way. They do, as far as we know, support 10 rare plant species. Obviously, that number is not fixed in time. That can change at any moment, depending on how protection goes for rare species. 4 of those, which I think is pretty interesting, occur exclusively in calcareous fens. You'll notice on the slide I put almost exclusively. That's just me being a scientist and accounting for the things that I don't know. But there's a possibility that we'll find it somewhere else. But as far as we know today, those 4 plants, we don't have them mapped in any other community. They're only mapped in calcareous fens, but I'm trying to give myself grace in case that changes. Calcareous fens are like a canary in a coal mine. So because they're so old and because they're a constant feature on the landscape, if they start winking out, that is a huge red flag to us that we're doing something very bad with our water supply. I'm gonna say it again, something very bad with our water supply. There is really not, and again, I gotta think about how I say this, because if you think about humans being part of nature, then this doesn't make sense. If we think that humans are separate from nature, there's nothing in nature, sort of plate tectonics, that's gonna de-water a fen that we know of. Not even consecutive years of drought. Now, maybe at some point, with climate change, that statement won't be true anymore, and there will be so much severe drought that we'll start to see fens wake out and be watered. But right now, as it stands, if humans are separate, there's nothing in nature that will do it. If humans are part of it, what do you think the answer is? There's definitely something in nature that will de-water a fen and cause it to wake out. It's us. Most of the time when we see impacts, it's something that is human caused by something that we are doing. So everything in this world is connected, absolutely everything, and fens are one of those pieces. They're a part of diversity on the landscape, and so having them builds resiliency in the system. And so I always like to think of it, I took a class once, you know, for fun, and this guy was talking about different hawks and how cool they were, and he was showing the hawks. I promise this is related. And at the end of it, he started giving this like big talk about diversity and why it matters. And it was the best example I've ever heard. And he said it 6 times in a row so that we would remember it. And obviously it worked because this was 20 years ago and I still remember it. He said diversity is the #1 indicator of health in any system. It's the #1 indicator of health in any system. If you don't have diversity, your landscape, your life, the world is less resilient. And I just think that that's a really good way to think about diversity. Why do we need it? Why do we need fens? Because they're building into that resiliency so that we can adapt to change. We all know There's a lot of change that's happening, right? It was just 73 degrees the other day. Delightful and terrifying is the world that we now live in. So we need these things to persist on a landscape so that we can be resilient to those changes. We can also think about them as a keystone community. They support all kinds, it's like rare things attract rare things. We did this weird mapping exercise where we mapped where all the calcareous fens were and then where the rare species are. And that's weirdly where we started to see, we knew about the plants. We didn't know about the animals that are associated with fens. And we still don't know everything, right? But Blanding's turtles popped out. Blanding's turtles seem to be where fens are. And they seem to overwinter where fens are because they're one of the first things that green up in the landscape. They're one of the last things to die because of that constant groundwater temperature. And they provide, in the summertime, a really nice, cool place to be and to cool down if you're a person or a turtle. If you don't know what Blanding's turtle is, think of the most adorable turtle that you could picture in your mind with a bright yellow throat. You don't need to draw it, you don't need to tell me what that looks like, but just think about the most adorable turtle in the world with a bright yellow throat. And that is Blanding's turtle. And in Minnesota, I think they're endangered, I don't know. They're super rare and they love fens. Another thing that we don't talk about is that pheasants and deer will bed down in a fen. I think on a later slide, we also find a correlation with some other upland game birds like snipe. We have some really smart snipe. We started seeing this in several of our fen areas where they're building their nests on the hummocks of sedge vegetation that are right next to a groundwater channel. And so we started thinking of this as like beachfront snipe property. And then they just have their eggs perfectly camouflaged in there and they're tucked in there. Super cute, very smart of a snipe, absolutely terrifying when you walk by one and they fly up at your face. But it's still pretty neat. So if you're still not convinced, I just want to refer you to this last part. They are just fantastic. And earlier last year, I had the pleasure of going to court for the DNR, and I said this to the judge, and I just want you to know that she thought that was delightful. So if you need to use it in your professional life, you should. Because even smart people like judges think it's funny. So why visit them? One, we work with the Department of Natural Resources. So we have, it's under our statutory authority to manage calcareous fens, or I should say steward calcareous fens. We also, in the South region, we have something called the Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan, where we're trying to protect the prairie landscape, and calcareous fens are part of that. And then we have other initiatives within DNR, like the Conservation Agenda, strategic plans, and all of those point to biodiversity being important. And because biodiversity is important, calcareous fens are a big part of that, and therefore we need to go visit them. And if I forget to tell you this, diversity, connection, and community are the three pillars of our natural world. And so anything that we do as scientists or stewards of this land that uphold those values is going to be ultimately to our benefit because we're building that system. Oh, there's a lady. Do you want me to pause here for questions? So we have this built up where we do like, I don't know, 10 slides or something, and then we pause for questions. And then we'll do 10 slides and pause for questions. Because otherwise we'll just be real chatty and we're gonna nonstop talk to you about feds, which you're gonna love. But in case this is the moment where you're like, I really had a question already, now's the time to ask. If you don't have a question, I'm not a fan.
I think we should probably keep going because
Keep going.
it's been a half an hour,
It's the time.
we're on site.
I know, I told you, it's gonna be great. You're getting your credits today, people.
We got one comment or question.
Go for it.
Curious if you can comment on the status of fen mitigation efforts relating to dewatering activities near mines.
No.
Yes, but I'll do that later. Jenny said, no, I can't, sorry, just kidding. We have an example about that later, so we'll cover it a little bit, like, hold it, put it in your back pocket. All right, this is in case you've never seen a fen. We're gonna hedge our bets here, hope this video works. Nope, sure doesn't.
Well,
Oh, your sound has to be on. We can't be muted for it to work.
Which sound, the,
Your computer sound would have to be on,
can you hit the unmute button for my computer?
but,
You can try it, you're good.
oh boy,
Maybe we should skip it.
yeah, we might want to skip it. Well, this is a nice lady, she's walking in the fence.
But the
She looks
best
great. She's
examples
wearing
of
a DNR
calcareous
hat,
fen in the
and she's
state of
talking about
Minnesota.
what fence look like. And go on up. She is a nice lady. Bias.
So what we're going to go through now are some basic things about what the components of calcareous fens are. And for me, since I'm a hydrologist, I'm kind of thinking that the groundwater, if the groundwater wasn't there, the fen wouldn't be there. The vegetation wouldn't be there, the soils wouldn't be there, the chemistry wouldn't be there, obviously, because that's where the chemistry comes from, is the hydrology. So you must have groundwater discharge in order to have a fen. It doesn't mean that all groundwater discharge is going to produce a fen in any one particular area. We know that there has to be other circumstances, but there must be groundwater in every single, in all instances. That's the basis for having that calcareous fen there. And for groundwater, actually, in this photo here and in this photo here, in that video, you were going to be standing on that ice dome, weren't you? Although this person here, I believe, is Dr. Jenny Lee. She's standing on an ice dome. Oh, is it? Okay, sorry, wrong person. Anyway, they're standing on an ice dome out in Yellow Medicine County on Sioux Nation wildlife management area in Sioux Nation Fen, or one of the fen pockets. And this ice dome is from the same area. But what I want to say specifically about hydrology is that groundwater hydrology and groundwater discharge has to be, can't have too much, can't have too little, has to be just right. Because if it's too little, you're not going to get peat formation and therefore vegetation growth. We get peat subsidence too if that groundwater is withdrawn and it no longer exists, or it's a lot less than what it used to be. And if you have too much, what you end up getting are things like this, where you get a groundwater channel. Here's a pipe right here. So some of that groundwater was being drawn off and being concentrated in this area and just created this nice little gully in this very beautiful fen out in Candido-High County called Regal Meadow Fen. It's gorgeous. I love that place. It's one of my favorite places to go. And so my point is groundwater discharge, not too much, not too little. You want it to be just right. And it is the Goldilocks of let's see. And so the chemistry criteria, Megan said I was a chemistry expert. I am not a chemistry expert. Last geochemistry class I took was about 23 years ago, I think. So I don't have that much, but I do know enough about it to say that these criteria here, the pH, calcium, the alkalinity, and specific conductance, those are the basis of what we're looking for in terms of water chemistry. So for wetlands, we all know that there are 3 parameters, but for calcareous fen identification, we need to have that fourth criteria, and that's water chemistry. And so what we're looking for is a pH of 6.7 or more. And in every single fen that I've been in, that pH has been, there may have been 1 or 2 times when it was as low as 6.7, but for the most part, what we're looking at is pHs between about 6.8 and about 8. I haven't seen a pH value more than 8. There may have been, and there may be some in other fens, ones that I'm not familiar with, but in the ones that I've been in, I haven't seen a pH that's more than 8. So basically, we have a circumneutral pH. Calcium of 30 milligrams per liter, that's something that's measured in a lab. So that is not something that we do on site. The alkalinity and the specific conductance is something that we can measure in the field with a water chemistry probe. And let's see, if we don't have a water chemistry pro, the easiest way to determine whether or not you have the right chemistry or not is to have your 1 molar bottle of hydrochloric acid, which is basically the same concentration that if you have a kid in high school and they're in a biology class and they're using hydrochloric acid. That's the same thing. I know because my husband gave me some for my birthday one year. And so I take that bottle out in the field with me. So it's fairly safe. And what you should get is you put a few drops on this background here is a precipitate of calcium carbonate, and it should effervesce pretty violently when you put a couple drops of hydrochloric acid in it. It's you too. Okay, so I guess. There. Oh. So I'm gonna read a couple things just to make sure that I say this correctly. So fen peats commonly have a greater than 10% carbonate content at the surface, which may overlie a carbonate depleted zone. And I've seen this when I've taken soil samples. I'll have a nice strong reaction to hydrochloric acid in the first inch or 2 inches or 3 inches or so of the soil sample that I extract. And then further down, I have less of a reaction, sometimes weak, sometimes very weak, and on occasion, no reaction at all. And then all of a sudden at the bottom, I'll have a nice strong reaction again. Or where that competent layer is that I don't want to push my bone through. Secondly, in shallow fen water is a mix of about 80 to 95% groundwater, and about 5 to 20% of that is rain. It is rainwater. So even though there is fresh water within a fen, the chemical content in the groundwater should be enough so that it can counteract the acidity of the precipitation, and then therefore the fen persists. Calcium carbonate precipitation in fens ultimately depends on many factors and occurs when the water table is above a critical level, which may be near the base of the surface zone. Calcium carbonate precipitation depends on many factors along the entire ecologic flow path, from soils in the recharge zone to water levels in the fen. And actually calcium carbonate chemistry is really rather complex, and it seems even more so in a calcareous fen. And it would probably take me another 5 minutes to describe that, so I'm not going to. And he said, no, don't do that. I'll never get through. Okay, so the point of this slide is that there is a soils criterion, just like there would be for any other wetland. And what we're looking for are basically 2 things. We're looking to see if it's a histosol or a pistic abucanon. And those are the, I think that's from the, so I didn't put the slide together. I think it's from the hydric soil indicators. I don't know. I hope, should be, yep. But the interesting thing is that tufa, which is a calcium carbonate precipitate, that's right here. There's another piece right here. Actually, that's my hand, I'm pretty sure. So this is something that precipitates near the surface. When I found it, it's usually about the first inch, maybe 2 inches of that sample that I'm extracting. And it's very hard and crunchy because it's calcium carbonate. It's limestone. Very similar to what you might find at Yellowstone and what is that? Joe. Yeah, it's travertine, but it's called. And it's really cool putting acid on there because it really effervesces pretty violently.
Thanks. Okay, so we also have a vegetation criteria. All of the criteria came about because we're essentially trying to find a way to be impartial. So that it doesn't matter if I go out there, Scott goes out there, or one of you go out there, you're getting the same result. That's the idea. So we're trying to design the criteria in such a way that it sort of takes away user error a little bit, right? So for the plants, we basically have a point system, and if you score 50 points, you're meeting the vegetation criteria. And right now, our criteria is designed where plants are given a value of 1, 5, or 20 for some range. 1, 10, what is it? Yeah, it is 5. 1, 5, or 25. I get confused because we just redid the criteria and we have a new one that's in progress that does have 10 and 15 pointers. So 1 is considered a weak indicator. They grow in calcareous fens, but they also grow in many other wetland communities, but they're still indicative that you're on the right track. 5 is considered moderate, and then 25 would be, you're probably in a fen. And it doesn't matter what combination of those you get, any combination that gets you to 50, you're meeting the vegetation criteria. So a lot of times, you could meet it with 1 site visit, but our old the 2016 criteria is designed that you have to do 2 site visits in order to know. And that's because some fen plants are easier to detect than others. So it's designed where you do a June survey and an August survey. In June, you're going to pick up the sedges that are part of the criteria. In August, you're picking up some of these smaller plants like the Calms lobelia here that has a super fine spindly stem. It's usually a little bit easier to see triglocken. This is lustrous. This is maritima, so marsh arrowgrass and seaside arrowgrass. They're just little sticks that smell like cilantro. And so you usually smell them before you see them. So you step on it, suddenly you're like, does anybody else want tacos? No? And then you're like on the ground looking for that. And we have laid in fens before, sifting through the vegetation, smelling and trying to find them, because if they don't have this flower stalk, they look like fine blades of grass. And so they can be really hard to detect. So that's the way it's designed. New criteria coming soon. And when I say new, all I mean is that we wouldn't be a good scientific outfit unless we were constantly evaluating our data and updating it as we have more data. So the more we learn about calcareous fens, the better we can design the criteria to predict a calcareous fen every time and weed out other wetland communities. So that's the idea. So soon, new criteria coming.
Do you want to mention, Megan, that we were directed by the legislature to establish the criteria so that there was a formal procedure for what we were going to call calcareous fens, so that we didn't go out on the landscape and start calling a lot of different kinds of fen communities calcareous fens. The legislature directed us to be very specific about how we were going to decide what was a calcareous fen.
What Jenny just said. You like just did it, yeah. So, and again, it's like, it's twofold, right? So that we don't list every wetland as calcareous fen and therefore every wetland is protected in Minnesota, but then also so that it removes a little bit of surveyor bias. Like we all have to meet the same standard set. It's not without problems because the criteria is designed, you know, for a healthy fen. A lot of times what we're seeing on landscape is not a healthy fen. It's a degraded fen. So for the veg criteria, I should have said you can also score 35 points if the fen has been impacted. But then of course you have to document how it's been impacted, why you think that, all of these sorts of things. And that is not always easy. It's easy when there's a tractor in the fen, okay? Or when there's corn being planted in the fen. That's easy. You know what happens there, or at least you know the one thing that happens there. Sometimes when you see impacts, it takes a lot more digging and a lot more investigative scientific effort to figure it out. One thing that's pretty neat is in most of our calcareous fens, they have similar vegetation zones. If you do a lot of peatland work, I'm just gonna go ahead and throw this caveat out there. I am fully aware that pattern peatland has a meaning in that work. So scrub your brain of that for this moment and insert how we describe calcareous fens. So in a fen, a pattern peatland is simply describing this right here, where you have open pools and then that low sedge vegetation. Most of the time, this is where the rare things are. They're hanging out in these tufts of vegetation. This is also where the birds are building their nests, just in case you're curious. So I know this doesn't look like a pool, and that's because the water is so iron stained. And so that actually is a what we think of as a Marley pool, even though you're looking at it, you're like, wow, that water's real dirty. No, it's just real high in iron content. Then we go to a low sedge lawn, which is something like this. This is just a close-up view of one of the pools, so they actually aren't that dirty. And in our best fens, and I don't know why, so you can't ask me because I don't know, but in our best fens, there are snails, always. In fens that have been impacted, there are never snails. I don't know why. I don't even know what species they are. I just know that when I'm in a really good fen, I'm gonna see a snail. And I get excited. And so it's like another indicator thing. Someday I would love it if you know somebody who's really into snails. You can only say that to a group like this. If you know somebody that's really into snails, please get them to come figure out what these are and why. Maybe there's some new species. Maybe they'll be named after you. How exciting. So then they transition into these low sedge lawns where the pools become less visible. The ground surface is completely obscured by vegetation, but it's still very low. And when I say low, for me, that's like lower than my knee low. So for you, lower than your ankle. Like, but for me, usually it's less than my knee. Then we go into, this shows kind of both areas. So we go into taller seepage meadow where we start seeing more of our common wetland forbs. So we start seeing Joe Pyeweed, boneset, these sorts of things, bulrush, some of our taller wetland vegetation. And then typically that'll transition then into cattail. Of course, this then goes into the woods, and that's not part of the normal vegetation pattern. Most of the time, this condition of pattern peatland we see associated with dome fens. We don't often see it associated with apron fens. Sometimes, but very, very rarely. Most of the time in an apron fen, you just have low sedge lawn, wet seepage meadow, cattail marsh. And you're missing that open pattern peatland structure. Something to do with discharge, not hydrologist. This shows all of them, so I kind of like that. Anne hates when I take her picture in the field, so this is Anne. She's collecting a soil sample. She is in the pattern peatland. And then it's low sedge vegetation in front of me. And then over here, you can see that it transitions, or hopefully you can see, think about it as the vegetation gets taller as you move out from those zones. So it starts to transition into wet seepage meadow over here. And then if I had the picture far enough, we'd go into a cattail marsh, but you can see that cattail marsh over here. And you can see the vegetation's a little taller, lower, 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 lower. So if you're out there, it's a little more obvious. Okay, what does DNR do? So Jenny already kind of described this, so I'm gonna brush past it as much as possible. So we are charged with, or gifted, graced with the responsibility to investigate potential fens, confirm whether or not they are, and then once we do, we go through a listing process where we essentially vet that calcareous fen amongst other ecologists and scientists within DNR to make sure we all agree, yep, that's calcareous fen, and yep, it meets the criteria. After it meets the criteria, and our commissioner's office signs off on it, then these fens get listed in the state register. Usually a point of confusion for people is there is a lag time between finding a fen and listing a fen. And so a question usually arises, well, is it protected only when it's listed? No, as soon as we know it exists, it's protected. That is how the statute reads, and that is how we have interpreted it since 19 whatever, when that statute was passed. So as soon as we know about it, and it is a fen, and we've done our documentation, it counts. Now, we want to be good stewards, we want to be transparent, so obviously we're trying as hard as we can to get it on the state register, but writing the 40-page report that goes with that is no small task. So it is something that we have to compile all that data together. Then it's also part of our responsibilities that we have to supply a list to Bowser. Why do you think that is? That's be in this room. Something in my throat. The Wetland Conservation Act exists in Minnesota. There's this agency called Bowser. You guys know that? They don't administer it, right? The LGUs administer it, but they're sort of like the overseer of the WACA. And so we provide them with a list for transparency and to be a good partner to them. Weirdly, under WACA, or maybe goodly, I don't know, but DNR has sole authority and discretion for what happens with calcareous fens. So even though we are not the regulating authority for WACA, that lies with the local unit of government, we are the authority for calcareous fens. And so we will be in the business if there's a calcareous fen there, and we'll be directing how that should go, what you can and can't do, if you need a permit, if you don't need a permit, all the things that Jenny's gonna talk about more later. I told you I would speed it up. We just gotta get rolling. Okay, this is the part I know less about. I shouldn't say that to start out. But this is new and I see the inside version. So fact check me with what you see when you see the external version, right? So Minnesota Conservation Explorer is an awesome new tool. When I moved to Minnesota and I came here, I thought it was wild that we had no external facing screening tool, that somebody could basically upload their project shapefile and then see how it interacts with all of the potential, what are called hazards, but potential points of concern that they're gonna have to resolve throughout the process. Like, how does it intersect with bird species? How does it intersect with native plant communities? How does it intersect with calcareous fens or trout streams or things that we already know are protected? To give a project proposer the ability to position their project in such a way that they could have avoidance, instead of doing all of that after the fact internally through a lot of dialogue. And the reason I thought it was weird is because I moved here from Indiana, and Indiana had this. I did not understand how I moved to Minnesota, and Minnesota did not have this. For being a state that has far more natural resource protection laws. If you're from Indiana, you know what I'm talking about. I'm not apologizing. So I'm just saying, like, it was kind of wild. So this is very exciting. We have this now. Unless you have a special license agreement with DNR, you still can't see rare species. So these are the layers that you can see. Many folks who do wetland delineations, or the company or people within the company, have a license agreement. So therefore you can see the rare species polygons and what those species are, and you have more positioning ability. If you don't, or you don't want to, you can still try to position your project and then submit it through the Conservation Explorer tool for natural heritage review, where our staff do that for you, and we tell you what the points of concerns are and what permits you're gonna need to get related to rare species. And then we'll also signify if we think there's WACA concerns or other laws at play that you might have to figure out how you're gonna comply with. Fair enough? Okay. Okay, internally, we also have some tools that function like this for our staff that essentially screen the landscape anytime a project is proposed. 1 mile for rare species, native plant communities, sites of biodiversity significance, things like that. 5 miles for calcareous fens. Why do you think 5 miles for fens? Because they're cool.
Recharge.
Did somebody else? We got put it in the back. Yes, he's running. So because as our very, very famous calcareous fen scientist Jenny Lee would say, if 15 miles, what did she say? 5 miles, if not 25 miles, because the watershed for a calcareous fen can be huge. And so we do have legal support and court cases that support going out a distance of 5 miles to see how we're impacting that ground watershed for the fens. And so therefore we put that right into our policy. If somehow in the future we got a different court case that upheld 10 miles, 25, we would put that in the policy. I doubt that that's gonna happen, but 5 miles is a pretty good win. So this is just giving you an idea of, this is your project right here, and this little red star is the calcareous fen. In this one, you can tell it's pretty urban, right? And we don't see any features of concern that ping on the map. That doesn't mean that there's no feature of concern there, right? Absence of data doesn't mean absence of resources. Does that make sense? So it could be when a DNR person looks at this, we look at all of our layers, but if for some reason we weren't seeing just ag fields, maybe we were seeing what looked to be habitat, and we knew some things about that area because of surveys we've done or work that we've done, we might still require a survey in certain areas.
You said 5 miles is based off a recharge, what's 1 mile based off of that?
For rare species,
Yeah.
it's also based off of our statute and policy and rules and court cases that have upheld that distance.
Like saying like a seed will go a mile, or is there like any basis behind it, or not really?
Oh, and project impacts, and every project's a little different, so 1 mile has been our standardized distance for a really long time. We're talking like mining projects, wind projects, solar projects, I'm trying to think of other use projects. What am I missing? Any wind, solar, forestry? Oh, water appropriation, anything that uses water, what's a mile? So we look a mile, but I think I get what you're getting at. It doesn't mean that we're considering that the impacts extend to a mile. That's project specific. So we're screening within a mile to see if there's anything that could potentially impact it. An example of something that you might find within a mile that could impact your project, let's talk about adorable Blandings turtles. So let's say you had a Blandings turtle down here. And let's say the project that you're doing right here, let's say this is like an amazing complex of wetlands. It's not, but let's pretend. Because we know that Blandings turtles use that habitat, because we know that they move, that might be something where we would require more surveys and more effort in there, because there's a probability that Blandings turtles would persist. We're not saying that Blandings turtles are just hanging out in the city and moving all around and living their best life, right? Am I making sense? It's good when you're not. So that's the idea. It doesn't mean that there's impacts that extend to a mile. That's very project specific and it's record specific, like based on what we find and what is occurring within there. I feel like you have another question. So
I do. I was also wondering, with the calcareous fen, when it gets designated, if after so much time it's gotten degraded to the point where it doesn't meet the criteria anymore, is it then delisted or does it still stay on the list?
It's a great question.
It'll be the same process. So the statute reads that we need to maintain the list. So if we wanted to, we could update the list and take some of them off, but we've never done that. We've never felt the need to do that. There are occasionally some fens that are so degraded that we think there's no method of them coming back to the landscape. And so then we just make our regulatory decisions around that knowledge. So we say, well, that project can't make the fen any worse, the fen's really, so we just wouldn't require like avoidance.
And we wouldn't limit a permit based off of the fen that isn't there anymore. But I do want to point out, if there ever was a delisting process, which we're focused on the other side of that, which is mountains of work. If there ever was, it would be just as rigorous as the listing process. So it wouldn't be a thing where one person goes out there and says, "Fen's not here." It would be a thing where it's multiple site visits, multiple due diligence, multiple years of data collection to then confidently say, okay, yeah, it's not here anymore. This is all you do. First time.
So I just wanted to put this in here for context about when, say, a project proposer might bring something in front of the DNR. Oftentimes it's during the WACA process. So as a member of the TEP, our DNR TEP representative might see it. They might say, hey, there's also a calcareous fen within X amount of distance. And there may be a delineation for like this example here where it's a long linear project. And within that project, there are multiple wetlands. We might say, we need you to go out there because we know there is Calcareous sterilis in this area, and you might then have to do extra surveying within the delineated areas to determine within the wetlands, are there pockets of calcareous fen? And then in that case, the regular wetland delineator who delineated all the wetlands may not have the competency needed, like the botanical background, to go out there and identify the specific calciphiles that we're looking for within those pockets. So sometimes we have to tell these big linear project proposers, now you need to look for somebody who has that experience that's able to do that, and that might not be the same person who delineated your wetland, just because a lot of delineators just don't have that specialized experience. So that can, luckily, it oftentimes comes up during WACA, which is early on in a project coordination process. so we can work through these steps with folks. I just want to say that occasionally, like, you know, there might be a farmer or something, and might come up when somebody's asking to put in some drain tile or something, and that farmer probably cannot hire a skilled botanist to go out there. And DNR may step in then and say, all right, we'll come out and check it out for you. But for big linear projects like wind or pipelines or solar, we're gonna put that upon the applicant to find somebody to go out there and have a deeper look.
And in Jenny's example, just so it's clear from the 1 mile, so this is a linear project, they're going out 1 mile from that linear line. And
Is that right, Scott?
There's a fen actually kind of covered up by the unit 2 sign. So that's where the fen is, but it's not, it's right, it's, that area's probably been impacted by shifts in hydrology, groundwater discharge. So probably back in the day, it was a much larger feature for pockets. So this is, associated with glacial Lake Agassiz from the beach ridges, but, it's really because of the land use and anthropogenic activity. It's
Multiple.
True calcareous fens are really small up there.
Yeah, so multiple steps to get from like the full delineation of the project corridor, then you might find multiple areas that have Carrickstralis, and then we'll narrow it down even further to what actually needs to get avoided in order to not trigger a calcareous fen management plan.
Are we listing this one to the north, right?
Okay.
And that's what she just put right up. It's a conversation for a different day.
So we maintain a list of surveyors and I'm gonna.
Sorry.
There's always one in every class, it's always a problem. I don't know, I don't have anything to do with that project, so I can't even give you a sneaky answer right now. So, for people who are going out, in addition to being a wetland delineator, you would need to be a trained surveyor in order to map the Calcareous Fen. And then, cause I'm already predicting this face from Scott. No, currently we don't have a list of surveyors that can map Calcareous Fen communities, but that is coming. So right now, what we have is a list of surveyors who the DNR considers qualified to map rare species. And so by default, if you were on a rare species list to map some of the rare things that occur within Calcareous Fens, then you meet the criteria to map Calcareous Fen. I know, it's confusing. So we recently changed this. We didn't change it just for funsies. We changed it because we were having problems with very large companies that employ a lot of people getting their company on the list and saying this company, I'm not going to list company names, but XYZ company has qualified surveyors. And then through time, what we were finding is we weren't necessarily trusting all the surveys that were coming in from those larger companies. And so we needed a process where it's not just that you get on the list and you're done, you're on the list, that you get on the list and we are vetting and verifying that you really can still do this work and you do still know what these species look like. And what we're getting is what you're saying we're getting. Does that make sense? Or what you're saying we're getting is actually what we're getting. So the process now, you gotta take a test. Everybody loves a test. You gotta go to our office to do it, our main headquarters, and then you can get certified. I should have had this first. You can get certified in all of these different categories. How fun is that? Things that have a star also have a field component. So things that don't have a star mean that it's all an in-office test. I know, who knew? And you could probably guess that a lot of times the things that have a star is because they're really hard. Like, it's also really hard to press a muscle, don't know if you've ever tried. So things that are a little harder, and there's also, we already know, probably a niche group of people who really have that expertise, then you're gonna have to do additional things to get tested. We probably, I shouldn't say this, but I will. We probably will change these categories in the future because when you look across the ecological provinces, they're absolutely ginormous, right? And it becomes hard to interpret, like, does a person who gets certification in the Prairie Parkland province really have expertise in all of the ecological communities that fall within that province. So do you really know your prairies as well as your rock outcrops, as well as your calcareous fens, as well as your wet seepage meadows, as well as your blah, 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 blah. See what I'm saying? So we're figuring out how we can refine this, but not make it super onerous, but so that it's more obvious what ecological community your expertise lies within. Make sense? So it's kind of an evolving thing. I just want to go back to this slide really quick. But if you are a surveyor and you, I was gonna make a Game of Thrones reference, but I won't. Let's say that you're chosen. You basically go out, survey, you have to provide a complete report to DNR. We collect voucher specimens. Those voucher specimens are verified by the DNR botanist. The specimens are given to the place, the herbarium at the U. What is it called? The Bell Museum. Thank you. So like the place where they keep the plants. The Bell Museum, obviously I voucher many things. I don't. And then you submit that report to the NHAS staff, our natural heritage staff, and from there, it makes its way through all of the complicated channels within DNR. So like, if it's in the South region, I will see it, and the non-game biologist will see it. We'll give our comments back to the heritage staff, and our regional environmental assessment ecologist will also see it. Sometimes people know that convoluted internal process, and they'll do a helpful thing, which is email us a report. And it is a helpful thing because then I have more time to look at that report before it officially funnels down to me. And so usually that expedites my workflow and you can get a faster response sometimes because I've already had it as soon as you submitted it, which means I've already looked at it. And then I already have my comments ready to go when it's officially triggered down.
So this is not the process for calcareous fens, but for specific plants within calcareous fens?
Correct.
Is that where you're doing that?
Yeah, and Keeler, I believe, is going to use this process to create a calcareous fen surveyor list. And it may be something where if you're certified for Caricterilis, Brincospora, Scleria verticillata, the things that are rare plants that occur within fens, you become a calcareous fen surveyor. Or maybe that you have to take your own test. We don't know yet. To be TBD. So right now, the only, like, to be a surveyor or on the surveyor's list, it's only for taxa. It's not for communities. Does that make sense? Again, not a process that I participate in, so. You're right. See these notes so I can practice where you talk.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna go through, some additional technical stuff, the really fun stuff. Yes, I can see my eyes are rolling, yeah. So before we go out in the field, we do some desktop analysis. And that's so that we can get to this point here where Keeler Andrews is standing. I don't remember which fen this is, but
Shelburne.
was it Shelburne 22? Shelburne 22, which is one of my favorite fens actually, so I don't know why I didn't recognize it.
How dare you?
So anyway, we do a desktop analysis. So if we are going out to a site where we don't necessarily, where we haven't been in 25, 30 years, the fen might look, hopefully it wouldn't look any different than what it looked like 25 years ago. It should look basically the same. But the mapping that was done back then, there was no such thing as a GPS unit. So they just drew it on a topographic map and said, here's where I think it is. Not necessarily so. So we utilize the desktop analysis and look at all of these different criteria before we go out so that we can maybe refine our search so that we're not looking over, oh gosh, how many square miles sometimes?
So many.
Yeah, and it can be some distance. So we do things like look to see if there are hydric soils, and in just a couple slides from now, I'll show you that that is not necessarily a very good indicator of whether there's a calcareous fen in the area or not. We do sometimes look at observation well data to see if there is upwelling groundwater. We'll look at the Minnesota well index to see whether or not there is, to see whether or not there are high water tables, especially for confined aquifers, or maybe if there are flowing wells in the area as well. This is the one thing that I really look at, is to identify the landscape position. Excuse me, because I'm looking for something very specific, looking for a couple of things that are very specific, particularly when I'm looking at LiDAR data. And then we also look for areas where there are springs and trout streams or other calcareous fens in the area. Like what Megan mentioned earlier, the apron type fens will have a tendency to repeat on the landscape at approximately the same elevation. So actually we found another fen near Shelburne 22, and that was the same thing. It was well north of where most of the Shelburne 22 fen pockets are. That other fen, which was on someone else's property, he was a very nice man too. He was fun to talk to. The fen that was on his property was part of that wetland complex. So it was just really cool to see that. And then I don't usually look at the native, but my last before she was out. So when I am looking at that landscape position, I'm more or less looking to define whether we're looking at a dome type fen or an apron type fen. And dome type fens are going to typically have this nice bullseye area with the high point in the middle. So we know for regular wetlands that middle contour, the one that's kind of centered in the middle, dome type calcareous fens, it's going to be the high point. So it's always nice to see. This is a really well-developed bullseye. That's also actually out at Sioux Nation WMA. And this is one of the dome fens. And you could look over here and go, well, there's another one right there, but that's actually prairie right there, right next to it. So you have to be careful when you're looking at this going, oh, it's a nice dome. But no, not necessarily, it's upland. So, but you can see in the background with the aerial photography, it does look very wet there. So we kind of look at those two things in combination. It's a very wet area, and then there's a dome type area. The other feature that I look for in terms of landscape position is whether or not there is something that is, whether or not there's a feature that is convex in shape. And what that convex shape does is it helps to move precipitation as it's running on the ground surface. It helps to move it off in a different direction other than where the fen is. So if the fen's here, convex hill shape will drive that water in another direction. So there's less precipitation that will run off into the fen. And in this particular one, interestingly enough, this little star indicates that this is a fen called Genesee 21, which is in Kaneohe County. And I'm looking at this right over here. These contours indicate that surface water runoff is going to concentrate in those areas, almost like a little stream. And the fen, this particular fen, wraps around this hillside, but stops right about there. But that's because that's where the surface water congregates. And I suppose over time that there wasn't enough groundwater discharge to counteract the acidity of the precipitation. So we look at office assessment. We might be fortunate enough to have some observation well data available. We do have, oh gosh, how many? I'm not sure how many fens for which we have observation well data available. Usually we have wells installed in or near fens that have been subject to some sort of permit action. There's some sort of a groundwater appropriation permit somewhere close by, which is the case in this particular instance. And this is observation well data from Wasioja Fen in Wasioja WMA Fen in Dodge County. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Dodge County. So the interesting thing to note here is that the red data up here, I should mention that this also is elevation, going from lower elevation to higher elevation. This data comes from the deeper well, and that deep well is installed about 5.8 feet beneath the surface. And the other, I thought I ran out of batteries. The other data on here is from a shallow well that is installed very nearby, or maybe, I think about 10 feet away. And that shallow well data indicates that shallow well is installed about 2.8 feet. And this is what we want to see in an observation well nest that is in proximity to a calcareous fen. We want to see the deeper well data to be up above in elevation, the deeper well data up above in elevation from the shallower well, because that indicates that we have upwelling groundwater. Okay, so we wanted to see this. That's a good thing. Okay, and then lastly, with our office assessment, we're going to look at the soil survey. Now, unfortunately, with individual pockets of calcareous fens, they are generally too small to be mapped. And so in this particular instance, this fen is Chippewa River Fen out in Chippewa County, out in western Chippewa County. And this particular soil unit is Bellevue Loam. And Bellevue Loam is described as well-drained, not hydric, but it is a calcareous soil. So that's one good thing at least, but it's not a hydric soil. And I find this to be the case in many different instances. And it's just because the calcareous fen itself is not a large enough unit to be mapped on the soil survey. So you may end up finding that there is hydric soil that is mapped in or near or where the fen is supposed to be. But there are many times that I've come across this particular situation where it's clearly not a hydric soil. And there doesn't seem to be really any reason for that fen to be there in the first place, because it doesn't show up on the soil survey. Is that new?
Yeah. Go ahead, put it like that. Oh, I had animation, now it's all ruined. How sad. Basically, it was supposed to be a teaser of show me where the fen is without the arrows. It's a little easier with the arrows, huh? So if you didn't have the arrows, like if the animation was working, can you see the fence on this landscape? I mean, be honest with yourself. It's okay if you can't. People are like, nope. The arrows are each pointing at dome fens. And if you look close enough, you can even see the top of the dome. So you'll see there's a little circle here, and there's a concentric circle in the middle. And then right at the top of that dome, there's a black dot. And each of them have it. I know some of you are like, sure. Like, but if, I mean, this is also on a projector screen. So if you had it on your computer, you could see this. And then right here, there's another one. Here, there's another one. And then right here, there's another one. The reason why I'm showing this is not to be like, you can't see it, what's wrong with you? It's to be like, we do a desktop analysis. It's no substitute for going out to a fen in real life, in person. So Ann and I are getting really good at seeing these landscape signatures, but they're subtle. They're incredibly subtle. And sometimes still there's a question of where it is. Where's the fen? I love some of the faces. There is. It's a trick slide. You don't see it? You don't see the fen? It's right there. So when Ann and I were going out here, you can kind of see by this darker brown shading, obviously there's a big wetland here or a basin. The fen initially was mapped as this. Well, obviously there's some trees, so we got a problem if the fen is, it's unlikely that it's under tree cover. Fens are open communities. In southeastern Minnesota, it's very common to have shrubs as a component of a fen, but they're usually stunted because they don't like that calcium water. So it's the only time I'll see a dogwood that's like this height, you know, and not living its best life. They're struggling, and they're usually struggling on the edges of a fen. This is an apron peat fen. As Ann and I were walking and we were looking at this map, we always take a printed map with us for this very reason, because sometimes it is easier to see on a printed map than on a technology screen, or maybe we're just dating ourselves, I don't know. But I think it is easier to see. This appears slightly lighter green than the rest of what's around it. And I was like, let's go walk over there and see what that is.
So
That's
can
the
I
net.
say something quick?
Yeah.
So I think this is a really good example, particularly for this audience, that if you were only doing a desktop review delineation, you really might miss the fen, and that's why we look out that 1 mile or 5 miles, because we might see that delineation combined, we say, we know there are fens in this area, sorry, we're gonna force a more in-depth review, and we're gonna ask you to really check all the edges of the delineation and not just say, oh, well, we can see the boundaries of the wetland. Because, you know, calc fens are not necessarily so obvious, and they may not be contiguous with the rest of the wetland boundary. And sometimes folks will delineate an area and they'll totally miss the fen. This is why.
Yeah, I don't think we said this either. Average size for a fen is 2.5 acres. Obviously, that varies across the state, but, and this is not 2.5 acres. I don't even know. It's really, really little. And also has had some obvious impacts, as you can tell by this beautiful green edge on the basin there. Like, we already know there's impacts in this area, right? And so that's the other thing that's really complicated. We always want to take the best notes possible because, like Ann said, as we're going back 25 years later, sometimes we're asking ourselves the question of, was this mapped imprecisely originally, or has it just had so many impacts that now the only part of this fen that persists is right here? Like, was it potentially bigger before? And so we try to answer those questions through a desktop review of aerial imagery. Sometimes you can see that really clean and clearly, like you can see the change of not cropped, not cropped. Oh, suddenly it's cropped, suddenly that wetland's shrinking. Sometimes you can just see it and you know that tile went in there and you know that that's part of the story. Other times you, like in this case, we don't fully understand what's happening here. And that is life. That is the thing that happens.
Real quick, so that was like, where was that actually?
This is New London 24
Which is,
in,
oh,
is it Candy Ojai? Yeah, it is. Candy Ojai is also a weird county. If you live in Candy Ojai, I don't mean that as
It's
weird.
heavy, yeah.
It is part of southern Minnesota, so there's a lot of agriculture. Candy Ojai is an ecological transition zone, which is what makes it weird and hard. So through the history of Minnesota, the lines of where ecological communities lie in Candy Ojai County has always been shifted, and it's still shifting today. So it becomes really difficult, even as you look at that aerial imagery, to kind of tell what happened, because it's all based on where the fire hit, how the trees progressed, then they receded. It's all of these complex ecological processes, and that line is very obvious in Candy Ojai County. It's about half of it, and it has shifted. We see it today because we've never had fisher cats, if you know what a fisher cat is. Really adorable bear-looking animal, absolutely terrifying, will rip your face off. Not a statement that for you to write down, but it could happen. So they're adorable, they're tiny, they make a scary scream. They are typically a woodland species, and we're seeing them in southern Candy Ojai County now for the first time, and they've never been seen before. So we're just seeing that line like progress as we're seeing the habitats change and shift. I'm making the line with my hands. Do you guys get that? Yeah. So this is Lolly Ann.
Hey, Megan and Ann, let's try to wrap up in about 15 minutes so we have a little bit of time for comments. For questions.
That'll be fair.
Oh my gosh, okay, I gotta talk fast.
Yeah,
We're right. So we do have certain procedures that we go through when we're out in the field. One of those procedures is to identify the hydrological features that we're seeing. The ones that I see most easily are the surface water, high water table. Obviously, the fen should be fully saturated all the time. Soil saturation, iron deposits in this little pond right here. The reason why it looks a little pinkish, at least it did on my computer at home, it looks a little pinkish because it's iron stained. And there also frequently on these pools, there's a calcium carbonate sheen across the top that looks sort of like maybe somebody put a drop of oil on the top of the water. So there's sort of a rainbowy kind of appearance to it. And the thick mucky soil surface, that's something that I would see with when I collect my soil sample. Megan says that she finds aquatic fauna and crayfish burrows. I don't really look at gauge or well data, because frequently there's not an observation well nearby or an observation well nest that would allow me to do that. So, but you know, I mean, if there is something available, I might look at it, or I might look at it afterwards. Hydrogen sulfide odor, I don't usually smell that when I'm in the fen proper. I'll smell that more when I'm in the wetland complex around the calcareous fen. So, you know, you typically smell that when you're in the fen?
They have a smell, I don't know what I would call it.
I don't know. It seems more fresh.
Smell like peat.
So the soil criterion is we have this soil criterion that we have in the 2016 technical criteria for identifying calcareous fens. And the soil that we're looking at is organic, is not a mineral soil, not a mineral soil. If you are in an area like along the Minnesota River and you're in a fen, what you might have, because there are typically exposures of rock formations like the Jordan sandstone, and it's in a bluff, so if it rains, some of that's going to erode off and get into the fen. So you might see some individual deposits of these really nice fine sand, really well-rounded grains of Jordan sandstone, but that doesn't mean that Jordan sandstone is the basis for the formation of that soil. This is an organic soil. If you don't have an organic soil, you're not going to have a fen. Okay? You need to have an organic soil. Frequently, what we find in calcareous fens is a layer of tufa on the top, I don't know, inch or two. It might have individual grains, or it might have like a nice, hard, flat surface that you can walk across. Almost seems like a sidewalk. It's very hard. And the hard carbonate content that is in our soil sample is not indicative of a mineral soil. So do not confuse that if you ever do go out and take a soil sample. So with the soil sample description, what I do is I'll just grab my soil sample. Typically, I usually end up losing at least a portion of the sample. Sometimes I lose the entire sample and I've got to dig a little hole and grab a sample out just with my hand. But most of the time I'm able to use a 1 1/4 inch auger and be able to collect my sample that way. And when I do that, I'm going to visually divide it into sections. And it's basically just, well, this looks different from that. So let's separate that and we'll describe this and then describe the next, the next, the next, and the next section. So the first thing that I'm checking for, especially with the surface material, is tufa. And you can see here in this vegetative sample, there's tufa encrusting this moss, which I always think is really cool. I kind of like that. But when you grab a sample and you hold it in, you grab a sample, put it in your hand, it should fit in your hand completely. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to put your other hand underneath that and you're going to take that sample and squeeze it gently and see if you get any water out there. And then you're going to describe what that water looks like. Is it clear? Is it cloudy? Is it really, really cloudy? What's the color of the cloudiness? Is it gray, grayish brown, brown, dark brown, black, really, really black? I mean, I have a sort of a criteria in my head. So again, you look at turbidity, you look at volume, and you look at color. So in some samples, you may get a lot of water, and some you may get just a very small amount or none at all. Once you've done that, once you've made a note of what that sample is, you're going to squeeze harder, and then eventually as hard as you can, again, continually making note of how much water you get, what the volume is, what the color, what the turbidity is. And then also, finally, if you get any material that squeezes out of your hand, in between your fingers, the top and the bottom. If you get no material coming out of that, then you have a fibric peat, or a fibric soil, a fibric peat. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to break that apart, and you're going to make a judgment call as to what the percentage of roots are within the sample that you have in your hand. And then lastly, you're gonna color the sample. I usually start with the 10YR21 page, and that's usually the 10YR21 chip, and that's usually where I end up. Sometimes my sample is even darker than 10YR21. And just for comparison, I'll look at the color chips on either side of that, either the 7.5Y or the, whatever one's on the other side, I can't remember for my Monsanto, so. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll apply a drop or two of my 1 molar HCl, just to see and judge what the reaction is. So the reaction will be violent, it'll be strong, it'll be weak, very weak, or none. And if I have calcareous fen soil, that top layer is going to be usually either a strong or a violent reaction, because the tufa is going to be right there, deposited at the top. Okay, and all of that description leads up to this, the von Post humidification scale. And you can try to make these divisions between, or decide whether I have something that's along H1 or do I have an H3. I don't usually do that. I'm really only interested in figuring out whether it's fibric, chemic, or saponic. Okay. Bill,
That's me.
is that you?
Okay, we'll make this simple. So for chemistry, we use a sonde probe. And for pH, conductivity, and temperature, the sonde can do that in the field. So it's a probe that you stick into the water, and then you basically wait until it tells you what it's at, and then you write it down. We do collect chemistry samples from different zones within a fen. For our chemistry criteria, what we've realized through time is that those are minimums. And every fen has its own unique chemistry. It's also another way that you can tell when impacts happen. Because while groundwater withdrawal is usually the first impact, chemistry usually cascades right behind it. So as soon as you have that groundwater withdrawal, you start seeing changing chemistry patterns within those zones. And a fen can stay, an impacted fen can stay above that minimum chemistry, but its unique chemistry will change very quickly. Does that make sense? So it's a way that kind of helps us figure stuff out. To do alkalinity and calcium, we have to do titrations. So we collect water samples, we run the titrations, they have to be done within 24 hours of collecting that sample. And so neither Ann or I do that, Keelan does it, so it's a thing that happens. And then you also don't want to collect a sample within 48 hours of a rainfall. So for a vegetation survey, we do meander surveys, we do them based on the Army Corps criteria, but the idea is, so it's a timed meander with a base time of 30 minutes, basically to get through the whole community. I don't know that I've ever really timed myself, I shouldn't say that out loud, but because the idea is that you're walking through the whole community. And so that you're getting a good representation of what plants are there and that you are basically capturing almost all the plant diversity that exists. So however long it takes you to do that, it usually takes us about 2 hours of fen. And that's with all of the stopping, writing stuff down, figuring out what this little spindly thing is that you're holding, all of those sorts of things. But you have to have at least 30 minutes out there, basically, so that way you're giving it its due diligence. Bigger fens take more time. This is just, I think I wanted to show you an idea of a couple calcareous fens. So this right here, this is not a great picture on the slide, but it's a really awesome picture in real life, I promise. So what I like about this is the calcareous fen community is right here, nestled along the hillside. It's on a wildlife management area. And then in the distance, what do we see? We see a silo that's part of a farm. And the reason why I like this picture is because it is proof that farms and fens can coexist, is a thing that can happen. And that's why I like this picture. This is an example of a groundwater channel right here. And then I said the rare things or the fens that obligate calcareous fen species typically are growing adjacent to where the pools and the groundwater are. So calms lobelia is one of our strong indicators. You might be able to see this right here. This is a tiny little marsh arrowgrass, the one that smells like cilantro, right next to the groundwater channel. And what I really like right here, this is one of our marking pipes that's been in a fen for 30 years roughly, and the fen has reclaimed it. So it used to be white PVC, and that is all calcium buildup over that 30-year time period. I just love that picture to show that the fen is like, oh, you wanna put stuff in me? It's mine now. So I just like that. And then here's those little snipe eggs that I talked about. And it is, that nest is right here. So just a cool thing. Jenny wanted to make sure that you guys knew who to contact. So this is a new thing. Jenny is our wetlands lead for DNR. Then we also have a Calcareous Fen coordinator, which is a new position. And so Keeler Andrews, who used to be part of our Fen team, is now in that statewide coordinator role. So a lot of times if you're submitting delineation reports or submitting projects, you're gonna start seeing text back from us. Keeler needs to review it. This is who Keeler is, this is why. And then all the regional ecologists are also contacts. And then we keep talking about the DNR regions, but I realized we never showed you a map until just now. So here's the South region. So this is where Ann and I are. Our headquarters is New Ulm, but Ann's based out of Hutchinson, somewhere up there. And then here's the different regions. If you look on the DNR website under ecological assistance, it's not under regional ecologist, don't ask me why. If you look ecological assistance, you'll get all of our contact information. So
And
if you have
also my
questions.
name is at the bottom of that wetlands page that's on every slide, so folks can go through me to find you guys.
Exactly. Jen's our gatekeeper. I'm just kidding. She'll pass you right through. So, okay, we had a question really early on, and I'm gonna cover this probably faster than normal just to get us to the full question asking period. But fens can be impacted by many, many different kinds of things. First and foremost, in your back pocket, a fen is impacted by anything that's using water. So any kind of industry that uses water, or not just an industry, what else uses water? That's an industry. Do you drink water? You don't have to tell me how much. I'm not interested in that, but you should, right? Like you should be drinking water, and you get that water most of the time from
Municipal ones.
a well, your city, they use water. And so that can also impact a fen. So I don't typically think about cities as industry, like it's a municipality, right? It's in its own different category, but they're a big user of water. Mining or trenching, development, roads, pipelines, sewers, utility lines. And now we have carbon pipelines, which is a new thing. Sometimes this was fairly common in the 70s. And then even as a DNR, it was something that people were interested in doing, was excavating these small fen wetlands to make duck habitat. So fens are already excellent duck habitat. They don't need any excavation to provide that space for a duck. Ducks are happy to be in them, nest in them, use them just as they are. So we do have some fens that are on lists that we got a chuckle out of that back in the 80s were slated for excavation to make duck ponds. Thankfully, it didn't happen, so we still have fens intact, but it is a thing. And then of course, irrigation and cropping. And so these are just a couple examples. I work in southern Minnesota, so we do have a lot of agriculture. I would say most of the time our interference with fens though, or fen impacts, isn't usually agriculture. The top two that I deal with are usually mining, because they're withdrawing a lot of water out of the system. And then landowners excavating a fen to make ponds. Those are my top two. Less than, and agriculture would be third. So if I had to rank them in terms of the time that I've been here, like issues that we've talked about or worked through. So this is just an example, lots and lots of pictures of things that happen on the landscape, ditching. Fens generally don't like being ditched. What's going on here? Oh, okay, I have some good pictures to show you. So we already mentioned this, but basically, and Anne, in her biased hydrologist way, said that water is the most important, right? Water is not the most important, it's the system, but water is the indicator of impact usually first. So if you withdraw water from a fen, fens don't like that, especially if you don't have anything else balancing that withdrawal. So a lot of times we'll get questions about precipitation because people will say, oh, well, it rained, so I can withdraw more water because it rained. You're already there. No, why is that? Rainwater is acidic, right? And calcareous fens are filled with calcium. And so we want that rainwater, that's good, but it's good in a long-term storage for a fen. We want that rainwater to percolate through all the different layers of soil and then recharge the aquifer that way and fill up the fen. I already talked about changing chemistry, so I'm just gonna show you an example of this. Does this work? Gosh dang it, why did none of these work? It's so sad. It makes me sad. I kind of want to see if I can fix this to show you guys this. So none of the animations are working, so I'm gonna do something crazy. Jenny's like, you got 15 minutes left and you're breaking the PowerPoint. I want to see if I can, there we go. Okay. I'm gonna do something that's, everybody just bear with me. This is important. So what I'm trying to do in my very haphazard way, because none of the animations are working, is I want you to see the difference, and I'm just putting it on 2 separate slides. Don't mind me, I'm just making a PowerPoint while I'm giving this presentation. Okay, from current slide. See, all good. All right, I want to show you this because I feel like for this crowd, you'll be able to see it. So this is an example of an apron peat fen. You can see there's cattail off in the distance. This is another picture of Anne. So that's 2 now. This is a peat probe that's just standing there for reference, right? And then pay attention to this tree. So in general, because this is an apron peat fen, we don't see those marley pools. The ground surface is pretty obscured by vegetation, but you can tell that this is taller and this is lower, right? I wish that I was standing even a little further back so that you could see their feet, because then you could have a measure of how tall that vegetation is. But you're gonna have to trust me that it's short. What? See, this is what happens when you try to break stuff at the last minute. Okay. Same spot, same photo. What happened? Does this look taller? A lot taller, right? Do you think there's been an impact? Yeah, unfortunately, yes. And so we have a lot of documentation with well data to show that the water was drawn down, the chemistry changed, all those things, we collected all of that, but you don't even need any of that if you have your eyes trained on what the plants are doing. The plants are telling you that that community is shifting. So that cattail line, instead of being out here, is all the way up to that ash tree. This is the ash tree that you saw in the distance before. So it's all the way up to it. And you can see it's boneset, it's Joe Pye weed, it's bulrushes, it's narrowleaf cattail, everybody's favorite. It's Canada thistle, what the heck's it doing there? We don't know, living this best life. So this is a very bad scenario. This is something that we don't want to see. So this is when we've had a sustained impact for a long period of time and nature does what it does. It starts shifting to a community that can tolerate that condition. So now we have the task of how do you reverse that? And unfortunately, because fens were built on this glacial time scale, they'll likely recover on a glacial time scale. So nobody who's alive today will know when this fen recovers. I can say that confidently. People who are alive today should be able to see when we get the water back in it and see the recharge happen again, but we won't be able to tell you how this vegetation is going to change because it's going to happen on hundreds of years, not on tens of years. So they're very complicated. Now it's all Jenny, so Jenny's you got 3 minutes.
Luckily, we've talked about most of this, but this is just the practicalities of what happens if there's a calcareous fen associated with a project that's being proposed. And I think a lot of times you guys might encounter that if you're working for, you know, if you're a contractor for a private company. So this is what our statute says, that calcareous fens are identified by written order. That's how we use the criteria to identify them. And then we put them in the state register, and then we create this big list of calcareous fens. It also says that they may not be filled, drained, et cetera, impacted unless the commissioner under an approved management plan decides that some alteration is necessary. So sometimes folks will come forward and say, where's the application for the management plan? And we say, well, first we have to take your project in front of our commissioner so they can say whether your project warrants the alteration that you're proposing to this calcareous fen. And then, just this little part below, there's this addition, we can allow water appropriations that result in temporary reductions. However, when folks have said, well, it says in there that you can allow these temporary reductions, so just give me my appropriations permit to irrigate my agricultural field. I'm only gonna do it temporarily, but maybe every year or something, or every other year. But then when we consider that B, we still look back at A that says, well, we can't otherwise, impact a calcareous fen. So we can allow that as long as there aren't gonna be actual long-term impacts. Essentially, we can allow some dewatering or something that's not gonna cause a permanent impact to the fen. And then this is what our rules say, essentially the same thing. They must not be impacted if the commissioner says, yes, there's no way to avoid this impact. For example, there's a water treatment plant or something, there's no other place for it, or et cetera. Then there needs to be a calcareous fen management plan put in place. And that's something that we work with, usually some kind of a contractor on to develop, and then the commissioner says, okay, we've adequately documented all of the impacts that are gonna happen. It oftentimes includes some form of mitigation in the form of money or sometimes actions to try to minimize for the impacts that are surely gonna happen. Again, there are times when the commissioner said, this project cannot go forward. There are alternatives. Even somebody may propose mining. They only own this one parcel. They want to mine it, but the commissioner says, sorry, there are other places that could be mined that are not going to impact the fen. So sadly, a lot of times it will shut down projects, and that's a tricky thing that we have to go through. So all of these are within the WACA rules. Megan already touched on, DNR holds all of that authority for decision making, but it does oftentimes come up through the WACA process. So, if it comes up, it's good to make sure that the DNR representative is involved, and then they can pull in the other people that are needed. We already talked about that last part. This is just a map to show, like I said, calcareous fens don't show up on the landscape like a regular delineated basin. So we might send delineators back out there to meander some of the uplands if we think there's the potential for calcareous fens to exist in little pockets like this. I think I already covered all of this, just how we handle projects when there are potential impacts. It becomes a communication and sometimes a back and forth with the commissioner's office, and oftentimes folks have to get pushed into a better alternatives analysis. They may say that there isn't an alternative commonly because of money. This is we can't put in a bridge or something like that, it's too expensive. The commissioner will say, well, you can put in a bridge there's nothing in rule or statute or even legal precedent that says money is something that is a reasonable excuse for not doing a lower impact solution. So fens
That's it.
are where they are. Fens are a rich part of our legacy. Yeah, so we have about just 10 minutes for questions. Keller, do you want to check and see if there's any questions?
You just said you did a good job, maybe there.
Very robust discussion of the various things.
I saw on your water quality thing, you said you were taking temperature measurements. How much of a variation is there from the bird that's actually in the fen and the areas that are outside of the fen? And can you use that to help you identify fens, making your aim summer?
we start to fish. Not to identify a fen, because usually in the surrounding wetland complex, it's all groundwater. And so the temperature is gonna be similar. However, in an impacted fen, the temperatures are elevated in a way that they should not be. Obviously, like, these last couple of years, fen surveys have been hot, like 100 degrees and we're out there. Once you get below that initial, like, couple of top inches of water, it's still cold. I mean, it's still like 60-ish degrees, 65-ish degrees. Is that right?
Yeah, about three. So like, for instance, you're out at Sioux Nation. I was just curious one day and I had a little thermometer with me. And on the surface, like maybe about this far beneath the surface, the water temperature was about 80 degrees or so. Fair. Then I stuck my thermometer down about this far, and it was 60. So there's really a big temperature change between very great to bottom. And it's,
And you can feel it as you're walking.
Yeah.
Suddenly you're like, oh, really? But I'll also say that, two of our fens that are impacted by mining, the temperature was consistently, even in that lower profile, like 78 to 82 degrees. And so that was actually the first sign to us, because it wasn't being watered, that was the first sign to us that something was wrong. Because we knew that that groundwater shouldn't be that temperature at those lower depths.
and I should say, I think this is something that none of us mentioned, and it's something that you and I encounter all the time. When we're walking out and we're looking for a fen and we're just sort of walking, we'll get to a particular spot and we'll go, it's right here, here it is. And it's just because it feels qualitative to be walking in a fen as opposed to be walking in a wetland complex that's adjacent to that fen. It just feels to walk across and you just take one step on it and you go, yep, here it is. I mean, you see the plants there, and that's a visual thing, but this is more like, this is where it is.
And that's why we had to develop the scientific criteria, because that's where it is how we officially
Exactly.
listed our fence. Now we have like a report for it.
I want to show them.
Any questions online?
Yeah.
What do you got on there?
Beth asked about, moving forward, will qualified, or it was mentioned that qualified surveyors will have to demonstrate they are remaining qualified over time. I guess, what do you anticipate that process looking like for, maintaining qualifications?
I mean, I think right now what's proposed for rare plants is that periodically, like every 5 years or so, you'd have to retake the test. But I don't know that they've decided what periodically is. So I'm using 5 years as an example, not as an absolute. I think this process is new. I believe it just started in 2024, maybe last year, like the end of last year. So it's a pretty big change to how we used to do it before. How we used to do it before is you submitted a resume and some references, and then you got put on the list. And so now you actually have to demonstrate those skills. And I accidentally lied earlier. The stars are not for a field survey. They're because those tests are only offered at specific times of year. So like mussels is offered one time a year, not every quarter or whatever the other tests are. That's what happens when you look at your notes.
I don't think I think what that is, there's no test
Yeah.
for those other things. They don't actually have a test, so the mussels and the plants, the moonworts, Dakota skipper, they're the ones that have.
I don't know,
Like an in-person test or something?
Yeah.
like,
Online for.
Well, online for Dakota skipper.
yes, it's all virtual, I know that. But there's like different types. Anyway, all of this is new, and I imagine that it will
Develop.
evolve. So I don't have hard and fast answers.
Yeah, and I think you also have to, like, we have to do our annual reports and things like that. So that's another compliance component.
Yeah, and we're trying to make it, I know that sometimes it doesn't feel like this, but I will be honest that a lot of my feedback when I saw the initial requirements come through DNR was trying to make it less onerous, so not as hard, but also hard enough that we're actually getting people who are doing what they say that they can do. So that's the fine line that we're trying to walk. We're not trying to make it super hard. We're not trying to make it super hard, but like, you do have to be able to know the plants that you say that you know. And the problem is that, like anything, when something becomes harder, it's usually because there's somebody who wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing. Now everybody's gotta comply with the new bar. So,
Any other questions?
Will it be required that, you have to be on those lists to do the surveys
it already is.
For fence,
For fence,
like, what are you gonna do in the
for
meantime?
plants too,
I
or?
don't know.
In the meantime, what we normally do is,
Yeah.
it's like it seems to be working pretty good, but I think our main reason for wanting to develop a list of the calc fence is when those consultants are like, or when a project person is like, ooh, who can we call to do this more refined survey? So that we have a list we can provide out that's not like just in our head, so that it doesn't seem like we're being, doing favoritism or something, right? Because there's not a lot of people, but there's more than one. So we don't wanna just be saying, well, we know that
We
there
can
are.
always say M&R, like, we are the government.
I do have a question. You're talking about plant communities.
Yeah,
So you didn't talk about the boreal fens or,
no, cause I'm not,
okay, but those are still protected, right?
the spring fence you mean?
Yes,
Yeah, so spring fence, we didn't really delve into this because it's still in
but
progress.
they're under a whack.
Spring fence are fens, they're a special type of calcareous fence that doesn't fit our current criteria or our new proposed criteria. So they're gonna have their own criteria
makes sense.
that is for them, because they're
Yeah.
different.
But we believe that the statute still states, what a calcareous fen is, also includes those spring fens. It's just that we haven't refined our.
Yeah, they
criteria.
have definitely have a different suite of species, but are we supposed to use both lists now that you have the more recent point system with the?
We'll be in touch.
Stylus, okay.
Yeah, basically what will happen is when the new criteria is published, that's the only criteria you use now.
We're
And
gonna
spring
continue
fence.
to refine
Oh,
those
sure.
spring fens because we
But-
just haven't collected a lot of data from them because a lot of them are so remote.
I'm very glad that you added Denver Stylus to it.
Any other questions on?
Any other questions online?
Yeah, there's a lot of plans. It's good list. I like
It
it.
is. I think the original, like Jenny, they've done.
I know, I mean, and that's
It's
too, like,
crazy.
the other thing that's problematic, and I know Jenny's trying to close this out, we're gonna nerd out for a second. The other thing that's problematic with putting any nature in a box is there's always the exceptions, right? Like, there's always the fen that doesn't do the things that the other fens are doing, and then how do you paint nature in a box in a way that's fair and impartial and meets our statutory responsibilities? So,
I think we can just say thanks, everybody
We
online.
have one more question. What would give the DNR authority to require a survey by people on the list?
what would give DNR that?
To actually develop the list.
No, the authority to.
Regulatory.
Oh,
Well,
the
it's all
spring-
through our
the spring-
calcareous fen,
Yeah.
it's all through our calcareous fen statutes that we have to identify and protect them, so.
Yeah.
I guess maybe like a threshold of like distance where you would require a survey, would it be anything within 5 miles or 1 mile, anything like that?
Okay, so like, let's say there is a delineated wetland corridor, and we look out 5 miles from that delineated corridor, and we see that there are some fens. Then we might also look at our mapped plant communities within that corridor, or we might look more closely at the delineation, at some of just the basic delineation data sheets and say like, oh, well, this looks like a fen type of species that you put down. And then, there are gonna be those, including aerial imagery or whatever, that we're gonna say, we really suspect that a fen could be present in some of those wetlands.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times it's
We're pretty careful about it.
to us that it's not a fen, because that's gonna be easier for you to do the development thing that you want to do. So like, for example, wind turbines, if they're putting a tower up anywhere within a wetland, and that wetland, there's something like Jenny just said, that the delineation has some plants in it that were like, you will have to probably go back out and verify whether it is or isn't a calcareous fen. And most of the time, the company wants to do that, because if it isn't a calcareous fen, there are less
We're
steps.
just going to ask them to go through all of the things that we detailed today, but we're gonna ask them to go out there and say, you know, have a look, are there some calcareous vent indicators? And then we'll follow up. The main message I want to get out is that we are not willy-nilly like saying, now you need to send out a specialized person to check if there's a calcareous vent. Like, that is a really rare request that we do, you know, like, just because there's a fen within 5 miles of a project area doesn't necessarily mean that we're gonna send out somebody specialized. Like, it might be pretty obvious that that wetland that got delineated doesn't have any calc fen in it. To call this specialized person, and also it's gonna take 6 more months.
Good question. We're at 4:30, so thanks for joining online. Thanks for coming in person to everyone here.
Just
And-
like always, we've got the attendance sheet from people, and then we send that.
You can email us questions.
We'll give it up
Put our
for,
emails in the PowerPoint, but you can email us.
give it up for our presenters here today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining.
We'll hang out too. I feel like we want to say something.